The message came on a Tuesday. Not that the day mattered much anymore, but people remembered it that way. The way they remembered where they were when the sky split open and something that was not a star dropped into orbit and stayed there. It did not move. It did not respond to any signal Earth sent up. It simply hung in the dark above the planet like a judgment that had not yet been spoken out loud. The object was 3 times the size of the moon. Instruments on every continent confirmed it. Scientists measured its mass, its density, its surface temperature. They ran their numbers twice, then 3 times, then stopped talking about the numbers altogether because the numbers did not make any sense with anything they already knew. It was made of materials that should not have been able to hold together at that scale. And yet there it was, steady as a mountain, blotting out a slice of the night sky over the northern hemisphere. Governments did what governments do. They called meetings. They formed committees. They shared intelligence, which was unusual, and then they stopped sharing intelligence, which was not. Every major military on Earth quietly moved assets. Submarines slipped out of ports without explanation. Satellite uplinks were rerouted. Radar dishes that had been pointed at the ground were tilted slowly upward. The Galactic Sovereignty Compact, which is what the aliens eventually called themselves when they finally did speak, sent their message on the 14th day. It was not a greeting. It was not an introduction. It was a declaration, clean and cold and translated into 47 languages simultaneously, including 3 that had been considered dead for centuries, which told humanity something important about how long they had been watching. The message said, "Your species has been evaluated. You are classified as a Tier 4 biological hazard. By the authority of the Compact, your military infrastructure will be dismantled within 30 of your planetary rotations. Resistance will be treated as confirmation of your classification. This is your only notification, and then silence." The generals did laugh. Not all of them, and not for long. But in the war rooms and the secure bunkers and the situation rooms carved into mountain rock, there were genuine moments of disbelief that came out sounding like laughter. A 30-day ultimatum. From something that had crossed interstellar space and still thought 30 days was enough time to break a species. General Mara Vasquez, who commanded the Western Hemisphere Defense Coordination, later said that the laughter stopped for her personally about 11 seconds after it started. Because she had spent 30 years thinking about threats, and something in the back of her skull started doing the math on what Tier 4 biological hazard actually implied. It did not imply weakness. It implied that the Compact had a Tier 5 and a Tier 3, and an entire framework built around categorizing the things they had already conquered. The world did not panic immediately. The broadcast had been received by governments first, filtered, and then, inevitably, leaked. The public response moved through the stages fast. Disbelief, then terror, then something that looked almost like stubbornness. Humans, it turned out, did not respond well to being told what to do by strangers. Especially strangers who had opened the conversation with a threat. Within 72 hours, every major military alliance on Earth had agreed on one thing. They would not be disarming in 30 days. They had not agreed on much else. But that one point was unanimous, and it was reached faster than almost any multinational consensus in recorded history. What no one knew, what the Compact clearly had not considered, was what humanity had spent the last 2 centuries quietly building in the gaps between its wars. Not peace exactly, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. When you have been fighting each other across every continent for thousands of years, you learn things. You learn how to make things that break other things with incredible efficiency. You learn logistics. You learn how to move 10,000 people and their equipment across a mountain range in the dark. You learn to improvise, because the plan always dies on contact with reality, and the side that improvises faster usually survives. The Compact's observers, because of course there were observers, small drones no larger than a sparrow scattered in the upper atmosphere for months before the declaration, had been watching humanity fight itself. They had run projections. They had calculated kill rates and manufacturing capacity and the psychological breaking points of populations under sustained bombardment. They had built a very thorough model. The model had one flaw. It had been built by beings who had never lost a war they started. Dr. Yuan Fong, a xenolinguist working out of a repurposed university basement in Chengdu, was the first person to notice something wrong with the translation. The word the Compact used for evaluated was not quite evaluation in the way humans use the word. A closer reading suggested it meant something more like concluded, as in, the conclusion had already been reached before the observation began. The compact had not assessed humanity and found it dangerous. It had decided humanity was dangerous and then looked for evidence. That was not science. That was fear dressed up in official language. She sent her analysis up the chain, and it reached General Vasquez's desk 4 days after the declaration. Vasquez read it twice, and then called her senior staff together and told them something that changed the tone of every planning session that followed. She said, "They're not here because they think we're weak. They're here because something we did scared them enough to make the trip. No one knew yet what that something was. But the fact that there was a something meant the compact was not acting from strength. It was acting from a need to feel safe. And that meant they could be wrong. It meant their information was incomplete. It meant the model they had built of humanity had gaps in it. Humanity had 26 days left. And somewhere in those gaps was a war that the compact had not planned for. The first probe they sent down, small, automated, clearly designed to survey military installations, was detected over the Nevada desert on day 6. It was not shot down. It was tracked, carefully, by 3 different radar systems. And then a small team in an unmarked truck drove out into the desert with a piece of equipment that had never been officially cataloged and did something to the probe's navigation system that made it fly in a perfect circle for 40 minutes before it corrected and returned to orbit. The engineers who did it filed no report. They high-fived in the truck and drove back before sunrise. The compact received the probe's data and noted the military installation it had been surveying. What they did not note, because the probe had not been able to detect it, was the installation 300 meters below the one it was looking at. The one that had been dug during the chaos of the 50s and forgotten by everyone except the people who worked in it. The one that had been repurposed, quietly, over the last decade, for a project that had no official name and a budget that existed in the margins of other budgets. The compact's generals looked at their data and saw a species with nuclear weapons, conventional armies, a history of self-destruction, and no unified command structure. They saw what they expected to see. They did not see the 26 days of preparation that were already underway. They did not see the phone calls being made between people who had been enemies for generations and were now, for the first time, talking about the same enemy. They did not see the crates being moved at night in ports in countries that publicly had no relationship with each other. They did not see humanity getting quiet. And the one thing every soldier knows, the thing that gets passed down from every generation that has ever survived something it was not supposed to survive, is that you should be most afraid of the enemy when they stop making noise. The countdown clock the compact had set was at 26 days. Humanity was not counting down. Humanity was counting up, storing, planning, waiting. And in the underground rooms and the repurposed basements and the unmarked facilities dug into the rock of 6 different continents, people who were very good at very specific things were getting ready to show an alien civilization exactly why the compact's model had been wrong from the beginning. On day 12, the compact sent a second message. It was shorter than the first. It said that compliance indicators were insufficient and that the deadline remained firm. It also said, in language that Dr. Fong spent 3 hours unpacking, that a fleet element would be repositioning to a closer orbit as a demonstration of commitment. The phrase used was something close to visible sincerity, a concept that apparently meant in compact culture what a raised fist meant in human culture. 14 ships dropped from the main vessel and took up positions between the moon and Earth. Each one was roughly the size of a football stadium. Their hulls did not reflect light the way metal does. They absorbed it, drank it, and the darkness around them seemed thicker than normal darkness, the kind that made telescopes work harder to confirm what they were looking at. The compact expected fear. They received something more complicated. Commander Alexei Petrov, who ran the Joint Orbital Monitoring Station that had been thrown together in 9 days from 3 previously competing space agencies, watched the repositioning on his screens and made a note. The ships moved in a very specific formation. It was precise, almost geometric, and that precision told him something. Organisms that had never faced a real threat moved in ways that prioritized appearance over function. They wanted to look powerful. They had practiced looking powerful. That was different from moving the way you moved when you had actually been in a fight and learned what worked. He sent his observation to the tactical committee. It arrived at the same time as a similar note from a retired colonel in Brazil who had been staring at the same footage from a different angle. Independent conclusions from independent observers. The committee noted it, filed it under behavioral analysis, and moved on to the next item on an agenda that was now updated every 4 hours. What the compact did not know was that those 14 ships had just handed humanity a gift. By repositioning, they had moved. And things that move can be observed in motion. Before, the fleet had been stationary, which gave almost no information about propulsion, acceleration curves, or response time. Now it had moved, and every piece of equipment that could be turned toward the sky was measuring everything it could measure. A team at an observatory in Chile got particularly useful data. They were not a military team. They were 4 astronomers, 2 of whom had been planning to retire the following year, who had stayed at their posts because there was something in the sky worth looking at, and leaving felt wrong. They ran their measurements, and then ran them again, and then called the contact number they had been given by a polite government official who had stopped by 3 days earlier. The official had said, in a tone that tried to sound casual and failed, to call immediately if they noticed anything interesting. What the astronomers had noticed was that 2 of the 14 ships had taken longer to reach their new positions than the other 12. Not by much. About 4 seconds. For seconds at the distances involved translated into a meaningful difference in acceleration capacity, which translated into a meaningful difference in something else, which the military people who received the data understood immediately, and the astronomers only understood later when someone explained it to them. For seconds meant those 2 ships were heavier, or damaged, or running on different power systems. It meant the fleet was not uniform. It had weak points. In the rooms that had no names, the people who were building things worked faster. The project that had no official name had started as a theoretical exercise 7 years earlier, buried in a research program ostensibly focused on deep space propulsion. The actual goal had been simpler and more violent: to understand whether a kinetic impactor, launched from Earth's surface, could be made accurate enough at orbital distances to hit a specific point on a specific object. The math said yes. The engineering said yes. But the engineering required solving about 40 problems that had never been solved before, and 7 years was barely enough time to solve 36 of them. The remaining 4 problems got solved in 9 days. Necessity is a remarkable engineer. The lead on the project was a woman named Dr. Ingrid Halvorsen, who had spent most of her career being underfunded and politely dismissed by committees that found her proposals interesting but impractical. She was now working 20-hour days in a facility that had more resources than she had requested in the entire previous decade combined. She did not waste time being grateful. She just worked. The system she had built was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not explode. It did not burn. It was a series of very precisely machined pieces of dense metal that could be accelerated to a specific velocity and targeted with a degree of accuracy that made the people who had signed off on the funding initially assume she had made an arithmetic error. She had not made an arithmetic error. She had made a very good gun. The question was what it would do to the ships outside. Nobody knew. Nobody could know without data on the hull composition, interior structure, and damage tolerance of a compact warship, none of which existed. But the theoretical models suggested that an object moving at the velocity her system could achieve, hitting a hull that had to deal with the same physics everything else in the universe dealt with, would at minimum cause a disruption significant enough to be noticed. They did not want to destroy a ship. Not yet. Destroying a ship would be a declaration, and the declaration had already been made, by the compact, not by humanity. What they wanted was to demonstrate something specific. That the distance the compact believed made them safe was not, in fact, safe. That the high ground they occupied was not as high as they thought. Day 14 passed. Day 15. On day 16, something happened that the compact had not planned for and could not have planned for, because it required understanding something about human beings that their model had categorized as a weakness. An open letter appeared, not from a government, not from a military institution, from a physicist named Oscar Renner, who was 73 years old and had spent his career studying the theoretical limits of energy systems. He published his letter on a personal website that had previously been used to share his thoughts on birdwatching and the correct way to make coffee. The letter was addressed to the compact directly. It was written in plain language. It said, among other things, that the classification of humanity as a Tier 4 biological hazard was probably the most expensive mistake in galactic history, and that he hoped whoever was reading it would pass that assessment along. It was shared 11 million times in 6 hours. Then it was translated, automatically, into 43 languages and shared again. It made people laugh. Not the scared laugh from the war rooms on day one. A different laugh, the kind that comes from recognition. The kind that says, yes, exactly, that is the thing. The compact's observers picked it up. Somewhere in the great vessel above the planet. Something that processed information noted the letter and flagged it as statistically anomalous. A species facing extinction did not, in the compact's experience, write open letters with that kind of tone. It did not make jokes. It did not sound, in the way that the letter sounded, like it was looking forward to a conversation. The flag was noted. It was not acted on. The model said the species was afraid. The model had been built by beings who had never been wrong about a species before. The model stayed. On day 17, Dr. Halvorson's team ran the first full live test of the targeting system. The target was a decommissioned satellite that had been maneuvered into a specific position. The impactor hit within 8 centimeters of the designated point at a range that made the military observers in the room go very quiet for a long moment before anyone started talking. 8 centimeters. At that range. With hardware that had been built in 9 days. General Vasquez, who was present for the test, looked at the data for a while and then said something that nobody wrote down officially, but that everyone in the room remembered. She said, "Now we have a conversation." 13 days remained. The compact's ships held their positions, visible in the sky at night over half the planet, enormous and dark and absolutely certain of how this was going to end. They were wrong about almost everything. They just did not know it yet. And the worst part, the part that would matter most when it was finally over, was not the weapons or the targeting systems or the underground facilities. It was the 8 centimeters. It was the fact that a species facing a 30-day ultimatum had spent 9 days building something that hit within 8 centimeters of a target in orbit. The compact had given humanity a deadline. Humanity had used the deadline as a productivity schedule. That was the thing the model had missed. Humans did not fall apart under pressure. They focused on day 20. The compact did something unexpected. They asked a question. It came through the same broadcast channel as the first 2 messages, using the same 47-language translation, but it was not a declaration and it was not a threat. It was a single sentence. "Why have you not begun compliance procedures?" Dr. Fong had her team working on it within minutes of receipt. The word used for compliance was the same one used in the original declaration, but there was a secondary meaning in the root structure, one that only appeared in older compact linguistic records that she had been studying obsessively for 12 days. In the older form, the word did not mean compliance in the sense of obedience. It meant compliance in the sense of alignment, as in becoming compatible with a larger system, as in fitting into a shape that already existed. They were not asking why humanity had not surrendered. They were asking why humanity had not tried to join. Fong sat with that distinction for 2 hours before she sent it up the chain, because she needed to be sure. When she was sure, she wrote 3 sentences of analysis and attached them to her translation, and those 3 sentences changed the direction of every strategic conversation that followed. She wrote, "The compact does not expect to destroy us. They expect us to recognize their superiority and seek membership. They have done this before. Every species they have classified has eventually asked to be included. They have no protocol for a species that simply refuses." General Vasquez read the analysis at 3 in the morning and did not go back to sleep. She sat in her office and thought about what it meant to be a civilization that had never been told no. What it did to your planning. What it did to your assumptions. The compact had a Tier 4 classification. They had a process. They had sent that process to 47 languages with perfect translation, including dead languages, which meant they had been watching long enough and carefully enough to prepare for every scenario they could imagine. They had not imagined this one. She called an emergency session for 6 in the morning and arrived with a proposal that surprised everyone in the room. She said they should respond to the compact's question, not with defiance, not with a declaration of war, with an answer. The response was drafted over the following 4 hours by a committee that included linguists, strategists, a philosopher who had been flown in overnight, and 2 teenagers who had been selected because they were the fastest at finding the precise emotional tone of a message when tested against the full range of compact linguistic records. The final response was 11 sentences long. It was calm. It was clear. And it was, in the way that only humans can be when they have decided to be honest, slightly rude. It said, in essence, *, we have not begun compliance because we do not accept the premises of your classification system. We do not recognize your authority to disarm us. We are aware that no species has refused this process before. We are also aware that you came here because something we did frightened you. And we believe that a civilization frightened by another civilization's potential is not in a position to make demands of that civilization. We are willing to talk. We are not willing to kneel. *, the message was sent on day 21, with 9 days remaining on the deadline. The compact's response took 6 hours. 6 hours was, according to everything Dr. Fong knew about communication lag and internal deliberation times for large organizations, extremely fast. Almost panicked. She noted this. She told no one except Vasquez. Vasquez noted it too. The response said, * your position has been recorded. The deadline remains. *, but the word they used for recorded was not the word for filed away and forgotten. It was the word for held, the way you hold something you intend to examine again. The compact had received the message and kept it. That was not nothing. Meanwhile, the preparation continued. What humanity had discovered, over 20 days of working faster than it had ever worked on anything that was not a world war, was that the problem of defending against a technologically superior enemy was not entirely a technology problem. Technology could be bridged, partially, through understanding. And what Dr. Halvorson's team had done, what the astronomers in Chile had contributed, what the radar operators tracking the probe on day 6 had contributed, what 100 separate groups working in 100 separate locations had contributed, was understanding. They knew the ships could be hit. They knew 2 of the 14 ships were running slower than the others, which meant something structural about those 2 vessels. They knew the compact's observation drones had a specific blind spot in their sensor arrays because someone had spent 4 days mapping every probe they could detect and found a consistent gap in the 3 to 5 kilometer altitude band above mountainous terrain. They knew the translation of the latest message suggested internal disagreement within the compact because the phrasing used a grammatical construction that indicated a committee decision made under time pressure, not a unified command response. They did not have starships. They did not have energy weapons. They did not have shields or faster-than-light travel or any of the things that the compact had, and they did not. But they had 9 days of data on an enemy that had never been studied before, and they had the intellectual infrastructure of a species that had been solving problems under impossible conditions for as long as it had been alive. On day 23, Halvorson's system achieved something that had not been in any of the original projections. A secondary team working on electronic disruption, people who had originally been trying to interfere with the probe's navigation system back on day 6, found a way to use the targeting system's precision in a different way. They could not transmit through the compact's hull, but they could transmit through the gap between the hull and the atmospheric shielding layer the ships maintained, which was a gap of approximately 40 centimeters that existed because physics required it to exist regardless of how advanced your technology was. 40 centimeters was enough. They could not send a message in the compact's language, but they could send a signal that every machine in the universe would recognize as a deliberate transmission on a precisely modulated frequency, which was the universal language of "we know you are there, and we know exactly where there is." The signal was sent on day 24. It was directed at the larger of the 2 slower ships. The response was immediate and visible without a telescope. The ship moved. Not far, perhaps 50 kilometers, but it moved in a direction that an orbital mechanic named J10 recognized immediately as a defensive reposition. The ship had not been alarmed by an attack. It had been alarmed by the fact that something below it had demonstrated it could reach it. O reported the movement. The room where she made her report went silent for about 4 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. The compact's fleet moved on day 25. All 14 ships, pulling back to a higher orbit by about 30,000 kilometers. The main vessel did not move, but the tactical screen told a story that required no translation. The fleet had retreated from a range where they no longer felt comfortable. A species they had classified as a Tier 4 biological hazard, a species that was supposed to comply or be dismantled, had reached up from the surface of its own planet and tapped them on the shoulder. The compact sent no message that day. No message the next day either. The deadline was 5 days away, and the species they had come to pacify was sitting quietly on its planet with its hands in its lap. And for the first time since the main vessel had appeared in orbit, something in the compact's command structure was uncertain. General Vasquez convened a session on day 26 and said something that her staff would quote for the rest of their careers. She said, "We haven't won anything yet, but we've made them think. And a thinking enemy is an enemy that can make mistakes." She paused. An enemy that's never made a mistake before is going to make a very big one when they make their first one. Our job is to be ready when that happens. She laid out the plan. It was not a plan for a full military engagement. Humanity was not delusional. The main vessel alone had firepower that no realistic model suggested Earth could survive a direct engagement with. The plan was something different. It was a plan designed for a very specific moment. The moment the compact decided the deadline had passed and it was time to act. Because in that moment, they would have to choose how to act. And an enemy that had never been refused before, that had never had a signal sent through the gap in their atmospheric shielding before, that had never retreated 30,000 kilometers from a planet they had come to pacify. That enemy's first real choice in a real conflict was the most dangerous moment they had ever faced. Not for humanity, for the compact. For days remained. The ships hung in their higher orbit. The planet below was quiet in a way that was starting to feel, to anyone paying close enough attention, less like submission and more like patience. Dr. Fong stayed up all night on day 26, going back through every message the compact had ever sent, every word, every grammatical construction, looking for the thing she had been feeling at the edge of her thoughts for days. She found it at 4 in the morning. She had been right about the fear. She had been right about the compliance model. But there was something else in the oldest linguistic records, something that predated the formal declaration structure, a phrase that appeared in early compact communications with species they had encountered. The phrase translated, roughly, as, "the ones who did not know when to stop." It was used to refer to a category of species, not a tier, not a classification, something older than the classification system, something the compact used among themselves to describe the civilizations they remembered most. Not the ones they had defeated easily, the ones that had made them work for it. She read it twice. Then she looked out the window at the sky, where the fleet's lights were just barely visible above the horizon. She thought, "We're going to be in that category." Then she went back to work. The deadline passed at 3:47 GMT on a Thursday morning. Nothing happened. No strike. No ultimatum update. No sound from the sky. The ships remained in their higher orbit, and the main vessel continued to hang in its position. And Earth turned under all of it exactly as it always had. And for about 4 hours, nobody in any of the situation rooms or underground facilities or converted basements said very much because nobody was sure what the silence meant. Then the compact sent a message. It was longer than anything they had sent before. Dr. Fong's team worked through it in sections, passing segments between analysts, building the translation piece by piece. It took 3 hours to assemble a full draft and another hour to confirm the most important parts. When Fong delivered her summary to General Vasquez, her hands were steady, but her voice had an edge in it that was not quite excitement and not quite fear and was probably some specific human emotion that does not have a clean name. The message said that the compact was formally requesting a dialogue session with designated representatives of the human species. It used the word for dialogue that implied equal standing between parties. Not a conversation between a conqueror and a conquered species. Not a negotiation between a superior and a subordinate. The word that meant two things that recognized each other as real. It also said, and this part Fong read twice to the room, that the Compact's Council of Seven had convened an emergency classification review for humanity. Tier 4 was under revision. The new tentative classification was listed as something that translated most accurately as unresolved. Vasquez looked at the word for a long time. Then she said, "That's the best thing anyone has ever called us." The dialogue session was arranged over 48 hours of back-and-forth technical messaging about logistics and security protocols and translation verification. The compact proposed a shuttle descent to a neutral surface location. Humanity proposed an orbital meeting point. They settled on a pressurized module assembled in low Earth orbit from components that both sides contributed, which meant both sides had to trust the other's engineering enough to breathe in a room built partly by someone else. It was, Vasquez noted privately, probably the most meaningful gesture of the entire exchange, and nobody had planned it that way. 3 human representatives made the journey up: Vasquez herself, Dr. Fong, and a retired diplomat named Samuel Osei, who had spent 40 years negotiating things that most people thought could not be negotiated. He had been selected not because he was the most senior diplomat available, but because when the selection committee had asked every candidate what they would say first to a compact representative, he had been the only one who said he would listen first and then decide. The compact sent 3 representatives as well. They were not what anyone had expected, though in retrospect nobody could say exactly what they had expected. They were not tall or monstrous or architecturally alien in the way science fiction had prepared humanity to anticipate. They were roughly humanoid, which was either a strange coincidence or, as Dr. Fong immediately suspected, a deliberate choice to reduce the psychological distance in a first meeting. They wore environmental suits because the atmospheric mix in the module had been compromised slightly by one of their contributed components, a fact that the compact's team mentioned with something that looked, in their body language, like embarrassment. Humans and compact representatives in a room together, and the first 20 minutes were about an air filtration problem. Fong thought that was probably the most human thing that had ever happened to anyone. The lead compact representative introduced itself with a designation that translated into a long numerical sequence and then offered, unprompted, a shorter personal name that its team used internally. It said humans could use that instead. Vasquez looked at Fong and Fong gave a small nod that meant that is a meaningful gesture and I will explain later. Then Vasquez introduced the 3 of them by first name and the compact representative repeated the names back with careful pronunciation and asked if it had gotten them right. It had. Perfectly. All 3. On the first try. The actual dialogue took 11 hours across 2 sessions. What came out of it was not a treaty. Not yet. What came out of it was an exchange of information, structured carefully, that was essentially both sides admitting what they had not known about the other. The compact explained its classification system in detail, including the original reasoning behind the Tier 4 designation, which turned out to have been triggered by the detection of humanity's nuclear test signatures from a monitoring post 17 light-years away. The energy output had matched a specific threshold the compact used to identify species that had achieved destructive capacity without corresponding political unification, which was the specific combination they had found dangerous in the past. Osei, who had been mostly quiet through the first session, asked at that point how many times the compact had been wrong about that combination being dangerous. The lead representative was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Twice." Osei nodded and did not say anything else. He did not need to. Fong spent most of the second session asking about the phrase she had found, the ones who did not know when to stop. The compact's representatives exchanged a look when she said it that she had no framework to interpret, but that she logged carefully. The lead representative confirmed that the phrase existed and that it referred to a category of civilizations the compact tracked separately from its classification system. It said that species in that category shared a specific behavioral profile. They did not respond to superior force by calculating survival odds and adjusting behavior accordingly. They responded to superior force by finding the next problem to solve. Fong said, "And what happens to those civilizations?" The representative said, "The ones we remember most are the ones in that category." That was not a full answer. But it was the most honest thing said in the 11 hours, and Fong decided it was enough for now. What humanity came away with, when Vasquez and Fong and Osei returned to the surface and spent 3 days in debrief before any of it went anywhere, was complicated. There was no formal agreement. The compact had not apologized for the declaration, and humanity had not pretended that the declaration had not happened. The classification was still listed as unresolved. The ships were still in orbit. 17 other species within the compact were aware of what was happening at Earth, and some of them were, according to the lead representative's careful non-answer to a direct question from Vasquez, watching very closely. But the deadline had passed, and nothing had happened. and that meant something had changed in the compact's model of humanity that was significant enough to override their process. Something they had built their entire system of first contact around had encountered an outcome it was not designed for, and had, instead of forcing the outcome it was designed for, stopped and asked a question. That was not victory, but it was something better than defeat and more durable than a ceasefire. It was the beginning of a relationship between two civilizations that would be complicated and tense and occasionally frightening for a very long time. But that had started with humanity looking at a 30-day ultimatum and deciding to use the 30 days productively. Halvorson's targeting system was never officially disclosed to the compact. They knew it existed. The signal through the atmospheric shielding gap had made that clear. But the details remained unshared, and the lead representative had not asked for them, which Vasquez took as its own kind of message. The compact respected things it could not fully see. It was cautious around unknowns. Humanity had become, in the space of 30 days, the largest unknown in their operational model. The ships eventually departed. Not all at once and not dramatically. Over the course of several weeks following the dialogue sessions, the 14 tactical vessels returned to the main vessel, and the main vessel shifted its orbit progressively outward. And one morning people woke up and looked at the sky, and the great darkness that had been there for a month was not there anymore. The sky looked the way it always had, which was strange, because the sky had never looked quite so significant before. Dr. Fong went back to her university and sat in her office for a long time looking at her notes. She had enough material for 10 books. She wrote none of them, not yet. She was still thinking about the phrase, the ones who did not know when to stop. She was thinking about the 2 times the compact had been wrong. She was thinking about what it meant that humanity had been classified as unresolved and that the compact had decided that was the most honest thing to call them. General Vasquez went back to her work, which was now significantly more complicated than it had been a month earlier because the strategic situation of an entire planet had shifted in ways that would take years to fully map. She added 2 new items to her standing agenda. The first was monitoring for additional compact contact. The second was continuing development of every project that had been accelerated during the 30 days, not because a war was coming, but because a species that had built a targeting system in 9 days that hit within 8 centimeters at orbital range should probably not let that capability atrophy. Samuel Osei went home and made coffee and sat in his garden and thought about the compact representative asking him to correct its pronunciation. He thought about the fact that it had gotten all 3 names right without being corrected. He thought about what it meant to prepare that thoroughly for a meeting you had initially intended to be unnecessary. He thought about the 11 hours and what had and had not been said. He wrote a single note in the journal he had kept for 40 years of negotiating impossible things. He wrote, *, they came here certain. They left uncertain. In my experience, uncertain is where the real work begins. We should be ready. *, the sky was ordinary again. The planet turned. People went back to the business of being alive, which was always complicated and frequently absurd and occasionally extraordinary, and they did it with the specific awareness that somewhere out there, a civilization larger than anything they had previously imagined had looked at them and decided, for the first time in its history, that the process it had always used might need to account for a new kind of answer. Not compliance, not defiance, just humans, doing what humans do when the pressure is on, figuring it out, one impossible problem at a time, until the impossible starts to look like a normal Tuesday. The generals who had laughed on day 1 did not laugh about it afterward, but some of them smiled, quietly, in the way that people smile at things they know they will spend the rest of their lives trying to fully understand. Because the compact had declared war on humanity, and humanity had responded by making the compact reconsider the definition of the word. That was not the end of anything. It was, as Osei had written, where the real work begins. And real work was something humanity had always been, in its messy and relentless and completely unreasonable way, very good at.